We are this week in week 3 of a series called Jesus Questions, and this series really is built around the questions that Jesus asked people in conversation as he would seek to help them move forward. Jesus asked, as we have seen over the course of these last few weeks, many questions, like over 300 questions recorded in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as Jesus is in conversation, often not giving direct answers, but responding to questions with questions, but always asking questions that were intentional, that were purposeful, that were aimed at spiritual breakthrough. And so last week we looked at a conversation, we learned from a conversation that Jesus had with someone, with a group of people who were close to him, with his followers, about his identity, asking the question, who do you say I am? It's the big question, right? The big question of Jesus' identity, the big question of who he is, not just what other people say about him, but who do you say? Who do you say I am? It's a question that's a big question, and a question that we answer not just with words, right? It's not just that we speak the answer, but that we live the answer with our lives. That we live the answer, and we live in the question. We move from thoughts and ideas about Jesus into a life that's marked by who he is, right? We live the answer. But this week is a little bit different. Because this week we're looking at a Jesus question that takes us maybe in a different direction. Because living in a question, right, like what we did last week, saying we're going to live in this question, this question of who Jesus is, it shapes so much about our lives. To live in a question and to be stuck in a question is not the same thing, right? To live in a question is not quite the same thing as living stuck in a question, or really being stuck in the question, because it's when we have unmet needs in our lives. It's when we feel stuck in painful and difficult circumstances that are frustrating realities of life that we're not sure how we move forward when all of this is present. Stuck questions that lead to big questions like how do I move forward? How do I move forward from here? Or can I even move forward? Or does anyone even care that I'm stuck? Right? These are the kinds of questions that we tend to hold close, right? Even after we've gotten to the other side of some of the questions, we tend to hold on to them, that they become part of who we are as we move forward. It's hard to let go of questions that are stuck kinds of questions. Because being stuck in a question, like for a long time, dealing with uncertainty, dealing with difficulty, dealing with challenges and hardships, being stuck in a question, leaves us feeling hopeless, leaves us feeling helpless, and leaves us feeling alone, right? Hopeless. We look at the future and we just can't imagine that what's ahead is any better than what is or what's behind us, because it's like things just keep getting worse and worse and worse. Helpless, which is not the same thing as hopeless, right? Hopeless is about the future. Helpless is about right now, right? That it's just in a helpless kind of situation and alone. There's something about being stuck in a question, something about living our lives in a question that we can't get ourselves out of, that leads to isolation, that makes us feel like nobody cares, that makes us feel like we're all alone in this struggle. We know that stuck is a lonely feeling. And hopeless, helpless, and alone, those are tough feelings to forget. All of which brings us to a foundational question this morning. If Jesus is so interested in questions, right? If Jesus is so interested in questions, why do we hold on to ours so closely? Why do we hold on to ours so tightly? Why do we hold on to them for so long instead of giving them to him? Right? If Jesus likes questions so much, if Jesus is so interested in questions, why do we hold on to certain questions so tightly? Why won't we take those questions and give them to him? And this seems to be the conversation that's happening in the passage we're going to be looking at this morning, this conversation where Jesus seems to be offering an exchange of questions, offering deeper and better questions, offering questions that move from stuck into next steps. What's interesting is as Jesus has this conversation, the breakthrough moment for this man that Jesus is having this conversation with is found in a perfectly placed, intentionally formed question that sets up the exchange, taking a question and giving a better question, the kind of question that we can build our lives on, the kind of question that leads us from stuck into next steps. And so this morning we find our footing for this conversation in John chapter 5. This is a story that is part of a much larger story of Jesus' life and on earth, the ministry that he did, but it's a story that's wrapped up in several conversations as Jesus is having these moments, these stuck conversation moments. But it's between Jesus and a man who is quite literally stuck living in a question. Jesus, this moment is recorded as part of a longer string of key moments and miracles. This is a story where it feels like as John is telling the story of Jesus that it's picking up pace, it's picking up urgency. There's moments where he's with the woman and answering deep, hard questions and having deep conversation at the well, this Samaritan woman. It's a moment where Jesus heals an official's son and there's miracle upon miracle, and it's like the pace is picking up and the urgency is picking up. And then somewhere in the middle of all of that is this one-on-one conversation. This beautiful moment, this breakthrough conversation with a perfectly placed question. This moment is as Jesus in his journeys is coming back into Jerusalem. John 5, verse 1, afterward, right after all of these kinds of things have been happening, afterward, Jesus returned to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish holy days. And inside the city, near the sheep gate, was the pool of Bethsaida with 5 covered porches. And this is a place, there's all sorts of, not just superstition, but kind of superstition around it, that people, if they could be the first one to get into the water, when the water started stirring, that they would be healed from whatever it was that was ailing them. And so they would come and people would gather around this and wait for the water to begin to move. And so it was just this crowded place full of all sorts of people with all sorts of hardships, that they were gathered waiting for the water to begin to move. And so Jesus is entering into Jerusalem, but then comes to this place. John records it this way, that crowds of sick people, blind, lame, or paralyzed, lay on the porches. And one of the men lying there had been sick for 38 years. And when Jesus saw him and knew he had been ill for a long time, he asked him a question. He said, "Would you like to get well? Would you like to get well?" And before we get to the question, I think it's helpful for us to look at the action words in this verse. As Jesus is moving into this conversation, it says that Jesus saw him. Right, this guy among a crowd of people, not just the crowd that was like moving all throughout Jerusalem, but a guy who was in a crowd of people who were waiting and trying to get through and have a breakthrough moment of their own, get to the water when it starts to stir. And it says Jesus saw him. And that Jesus knew that he had been suffering for a long time. Right, that Jesus saw him, that Jesus knew and appreciated his story. He knew he had been ill for a long time. And then Jesus asked him a question. He said, "Would you like to get well?" How many of us, when we have felt stuck, have assumed that God is distant, that God is disconnected, that God is not paying attention in any way to our struggles, that we would even maybe take it so far as to say, "I'm not sure that God even sees me. I'm not sure that God understands the suffering that I'm going through. I don't think that it's possible that God could understand and know my story, the things that I'm walking through." When we are stuck, right? When we are stuck in these kinds of questions, it is so easy for us to say, there is no way that God is seeing me. There is no way that God cares. God must be disconnected and disinterested in my situation. And yet, in this one sentence, as John records this moment, this one verse gives us such a beautiful picture, something so important to understand about God. That he is the God who sees us. He is the God who cares about our story, who cares about our struggles. And he is the God who asks, "Would you like to get well?" And that question matters. I read an article recently. It was an interview as part of an NPR series talking about these everyday heroes, people who had just like normal people just doing things that changed people's lives, things that echoed over years as people looked back and say, "This was a breakthrough moment for me." And this article that I read was the story of a man who had been suffering an illness that was starting to lead to the lack of his ability to use his muscles. And so he was having mobility issues. And early in this process of the illness, the progression of the illness, he's at an airport. And he leaves the airport and he's walking out to get into his taxi. And as he steps out of the building, he he trips and he falls. A horrifying moment, right? A moment that it has no dignity in it whatsoever. And so he's on the ground. He said, as he described the situation, his luggage was everywhere, and he had just kind of made a mess of all of the things that he was carrying. So he's on the ground, dealing with his illness, dealing with his muscles not cooperating with the movements he's trying to make, and people are just passing him, just moving past. And he said, then all of a sudden, he hears a voice, and the voice simply says, how can I help? How can I help? And he said, so I took a moment, I gathered my composure, and he said, so if you could help me get this suitcase put back together again, if you could help me stack up the suitcases and help me stand up, and I think I can get there from there. If I can get my stuff back together and if I can get back on my feet, I think I'll be okay. And he said, what struck me as I got in the taxi, as I was leaving that place, and what has continued over years of walking through and looking back at that moment, he said it was that he didn't just jump in and take over the situation. But he said he gave me the dignity of the question. He saw me as a person. He saw the humanity. He saw a person who has something to offer still, who has thoughts about how the solution should come about for his problem, that understands and knows his limitations, but also knows what he's capable of doing. He said the question, how can I help, gave me such dignity in such an undignified moment. And so Jesus looks at this man, and he asks a question. He says, would you like to get well? There is such dignity in this moment, such dignity in the question that Jesus is asking, such dignity in this conversation, because what Jesus is doing is he's giving the man an invitation, right? It's an invitation, not an abduction. Jesus isn't just taking over the situation and saying, I have a better plan for you, and I'm going to take you on this journey, whether or not you want to go on it. He says, would you? Would you like to get well? And the man responds. He says, I can't, sir. The sick man said, for I have no one to put me in the pool when the water bubbles up. Someone else always gets there ahead of me. I can't, sir. 38 years of a man living stuck in the questions. 38 years of unanswered questions like why is this happening to me? Why of all people was this something that I had to walk through? What did I do? How could I possibly move forward? Who might be interested in helping me? Is there any chance that even if I got into the water that I could be healed, that life could look different? Does anyone care or even notice? 38 years, this story breaks my heart. 38 years just imagining this progression of a man going from this hopeful process of somehow getting to the side of the pool, thinking if I could just get in the pool, then life could be different. This hopeful move of setting himself up and trying and trying and trying. 38 years of moving from probably asking for help at some point to feeling utterly helpless. Over time, the overwhelming feelings of being hopeless, helpless, and alone. So much so that the man seems to have come to the point where he's not even asking for help anymore. He doesn't look at Jesus and say, well, if you could help me get in the water. He doesn't even assume that Jesus is there to help him. He's just simply responding to a question, but not really, right? He's not really even responding with a direct answer to the question that Jesus is asking, because he's living a story that's steeped in hopeless, helpless, and alone. So much so that when he's asked a different question, would you like to get well, that his answer is found in answering his own stuck question. Because he says, I can't. There's nobody to help me. There's no way that I could do this. 38 years of living in a stuck story. And then Jesus shows up with a new question. And the man's response, even though he didn't answer Jesus directly, the man's response doesn't end the conversation. Jesus responds. So Jesus told him, stand up, pick up your mat, and walk. That this is not, as I would see it, a very therapeutic response. This isn't Jesus saying, so let's talk about your feelings here. Let's talk about the things that you're experiencing. Let's tease out that answer. That feels like a loaded response. Like, do you feel hopeless? Do you feel helpless? Do you feel alone? Let's talk and process the things that you have experienced that have brought you to the point where you're not even answering my question directly. Jesus doesn't respond in that way at all. He simply sees him. He sees a man stuck sees a man responding with his stuck response, Jesus simply invites him then to literally stand and step out of his stuck question, to move from stuck in a question to a breakthrough question, to move to a question that he can live into, that he can live out the answer. That this question that Jesus is asking of him is a breakthrough question. It's a miracle moment, right? Jesus is actually doing the thing that he's asking the man if he wants him to do. Jesus is healing his infirmity. Jesus is dealing with his body that isn't functioning the way that he would like his body to be functioning. That this miracle moment is dealing with the illness. But it's also an invitation to a new phase of life. Because as Jesus is walking him through this process, he's dealing with the helpless and the hopeless questions also. Right? Jesus is walking him through dealing with these things and giving him a choice, giving him dignity, even in the midst of this life-changing offer of a lifetime. The question that would feel like an obvious yes, would you make me well? I would like to be made well. That Jesus sees him, and here's the response behind the resistance. And then begins this invitation to this new phase of life, giving the man dignity in the asking of the question. And John says this, instantly the man was healed. He rolled up his sleeping mat and began walking. He was healed, right? The key of this process, that Jesus healed him. And then he stood up, rolled up his mat, tucked it under his arm, and began to walk. That the progression matters, the order of the events matters, that he didn't heal himself by standing up. He didn't say that like Jesus had offered this, that like in some sort of contingency, that if he would do the thing, that then Jesus would heal him. And so it's plausible. It's plausible that Jesus could have healed the man, right? This is important for us as we wrestle with this question in our own lives. It's plausible that Jesus could have done the healing work, and had the man not moved, he would have never known it. Or had he not stood up, picked up his mat and walked, he could have been continuing to lay there on the mat, healed and ready for a new phase of life, but yet not having stepped into it yet, not having taken hold of it yet. Right? The progression matters that Jesus did for him. This was not a negotiation. This was not some sort of like transaction saying if you would do your part, then I'll do my part. Jesus simply says, stand up. Having healed him. And then the man responds, stands up, picks up his mat, and walks. He could have been continuing to lay on his mat, healed, but still living stuck in the question. Why do we hold on to questions so tightly? But Jesus gave him more than an answer. Jesus gave him hope. Right, the future now is better than the present. As he looks at what's yet to come in his life, he looks and it's all better because Jesus has stepped in and has begun to change his story. Just moments ago, the man was feeling hopeless and helpless and alone, and with one question, with one simple exchange in this conversation, Jesus moved him from hopelessness to hope. Right, a view of the future that's rooted in what God has already done. A view of the future that says what's ahead is better than what is because God is at work. There is hope. And this would have been a moment, right? You look at these moments in Scripture where if we were doing an editing of a video, we'd say, I think it's time to roll the credits, right? This moment, he stands up, 38 years, all the story, all the layers to this moment, puts the mat under his arm and begins to walk. It would be very tempting to cue the cinematic music, to let the credits begin to roll because this story is over. The big thing has happened. And yet there's 3 more conversations yet to come. 3 more important conversations yet to come. There's still some aftermath. There's still some echoes to deal with. It says this, but this miracle happened on the Sabbath. And so the Jewish leaders objected. They said to the man who was cured, you can't work on the Sabbath. The law does not allow you to carry that sleeping mat. Right? In this moment in the history of in church history, there were specific rules about what you could and couldn't do on the Sabbath. And so anything that resembled work could not be done on the Sabbath. This was a day to pause and to rest, to live in the echoes of God's rhythms in creating the world. And so they said, you can't do that. You can't carry things on the Sabbath. You can't carry that mat under your arm. You're breaking the law. You are not permitted to do this thing. And so the man, now taking some of those first steps in many, many years, having the mat under his arm, replies. He says, the man who healed me told me, pick up your mat and walk. Just a few short moments ago, the man's life had dramatically changed. Right? There was a dramatic change in his life. Not only his physical condition, but his life. That he went from hopeless and helpless and alone to now living in hope, looking at the future that's better than what was. But he also went from alone, right? There's no one to help me. There's no way I could ever get in the water. There's no one to help me. I am utterly alone. To now, as he's being confronted by these religious leaders, he's leveraging his connection with someone else. He's saying, look, all I know is I was told by the guy who healed me to pick up my mat and walk, and so I'm doing that. I am connected to someone. There's relationship that's being described in the conversation and the response that he's given. You see the emerging of a whole new way of seeing the world, a whole new understanding of himself relationally. Because he moved from isolation to connection. Connected with God, connected with others, having someone he could point to who says, there's someone who cares about me, who actually did a work to heal me. And so when the questions come, when the pushback comes, when people are questioning whether or not he should be doing what he's doing, he simply says, the man who healed me. Right? Leveraging the connection, leveraging the relationship that now that he has. The move from isolation to connection is such a big deal that when it comes time for the man to defend himself, to tell his story, it's just one sentence. It says, the man who healed me told me, pick up your mat and walk. A man who has a much longer story than one sentence, right? For 38 years beside the water, hoping, losing hope, hoping for help, unable to help himself, now moving into a process where he is walking, where he has connection. His story, when he tells his story, doesn't even start with all of that backstory. He just simply says, look, a guy told me to stand up and pick up my mat and walk, and so I'm doing that. Right? The story is now one sentence, what could have been like a much, much longer story. Because it's not a hopeless story. And so he knows with certainty that he's not alone anymore. But the conversation continues. They said, who said such a thing as that, they demanded. But the man didn't know, right? He was so caught up in the moment, he didn't even know that it was Jesus talking to him. The man didn't know, for Jesus had disappeared into the crowd. But then afterward, there's another conversation with Jesus. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and told him, now that you are well, so stop sinning, or something even worse may happen to you. That this now becomes the next invitation in this man's story to move not just from physically ill to physically well, but to move to spiritually well as well. Right? To move into a living well moment in his life. And again, this is a miracle moment. This is a moment that deals with illness. This time, instead of a physical ailment, it's dealing with sin. Right? This is a miracle moment. It's also an invitation to a new phase of life, right? The parallels of this conversation that Jesus is having with this man. It's an invitation to a new phase of life. It deals with the helpless and the hopeless. Because we're not talking well, not just physically, but we're talking spiritually well. And it's a choice. And Jesus doesn't say, since I healed you, I am now in utter control. You are now on autopilot. I now will control every aspect of your life. That there is still dignity. Jesus is still giving him a choice in the choices that he would make as he would go from this place. Even in this life-changing offer of a lifetime, Jesus in many ways is saying, and so now your next step matters. Right? Make it a step in the right direction. It's still an invitation. It's still not an abduction. He has a choice to make about his life. The reality is this, is you walk differently. You walk differently when you've been invited to pick up your mat and walk. And so then the man went and told the Jewish leaders that it was Jesus who had healed him. This man who was seen by Jesus, now helping others see Jesus too. A man that went from stuck in the questions to now answering questions. And he's answering it in the very best way possible. He's saying, Jesus. Right? All I know is Jesus stepped into my story, and my story is different. That Jesus stepped in and he healed me. In just a few moments, Right? We look at this moment this man is experiencing in just a few moments, this whirlwind of activity, this whirlwind of conversation that's taking place. He has moved from helpless and hopeless and alone to hopeful, to connected, and now from helpless to helping others see. Right? This is an incredible progression in this man's life. And it was as simple as him now walking with his mat, tucking his mat under his arm, telling his Jesus story. The mat that was the setting for his hopeless, helpless, and alone story has now become exhibit A in his Jesus story. Right? The mat that was the setting of his helpless, hopeless, and alone story has now become exhibit A in his Jesus story. And there is so much for us to unpack. If we could just spend time listening and unpacking this, every phase of this conversation, that there's so much we could learn. But as I have spent time with this story, as I have listened and tried to just take in what Jesus is doing in this conversation with this man, there are three, I think, key lessons for us as we lean into this kind of question. The first one is this, is that every part of the conversation was an invitation, not a negotiation. Every part of the conversation was an invitation, not a negotiation. That the man was given choices in the matter, that Jesus asked questions and invited him to make choices, but every single phase of this conversation that he had with Jesus, it was a conversation, it was an invitation, it was not a negotiation, that Jesus did not barter with him. Or how many times are we stuck in questions? Are we finding ourselves living in what feels like hopeless situations, and we come to God and we try to make it a negotiation, saying, God, if you would, then I will, or if I will, then would you? Jesus didn't barter with him. He healed him and invited him to walk differently. He did it twice. But none of Jesus' actions, right? None of Jesus' actions depended on the man's action. That everything that the man did was in response to Jesus. Right? It wasn't that he was physically well. It wasn't that he had somehow earned or responded to Jesus in the right way. It wasn't that he was living a perfect life, because Jesus comes and says, so stop sinning. It wasn't that he had cleaned himself up and made himself worthy of Jesus stepping into his story. That every phase, every piece of this process was an invitation that Jesus was initiating to allow him the opportunity to respond. Even though, or something worse may happen, statement. Right? That's a statement that's about the consequences of sin. That's a statement about the consequences of choices, that Jesus gave him freedom to make choices. And he gave him freedom to live in the consequences of the choices that he made. Every part of this conversation was an invitation, not a negotiation. The God who created the man as a whole person met him and cared for him as a whole person, right? Mind, body, soul. That he looked and Jesus healed him physically, that God cares about his physical body, that God also saw him as a full person with a mind and with a soul and with the body that was in need of being healed, that the God who created him as a whole person saw him and cared for him as a whole person. That Jesus saw him. He didn't just see his illness. He didn't just see a body in need of being healed. He saw the man. He saw his story. And he stepped into his story, that he saw the journey that he had been living up to this point. Jesus saw him, not just his illness, not just his sin, not even just his soul, right? Sometimes I think we get caught up in thinking that what God cares about is our souls, that as precious as our souls are, as hard as the devil fights to take hold of it, as far as God was willing to go to save ours, that it still wasn't just about the man's soul. As precious as that is, mind, body, soul, the whole person transformed by this encounter with Jesus, right? That his physical body was healed, that his mentality, the way that he saw the world, the way that he made sense of his story, the way that he understood the world around him was different. And then Jesus said, and then go and stop sinning. right? That we're dealing now with soul kinds of stuff. Mind, body, soul. The God who created the man as a whole person, met him and cared for him as a whole person. And Jesus gave him a whole new story. Listen to how he told it later, right? As he begins to tell his story, as he begins to testify to what Jesus has done in his life, he doesn't start with all of the stuff that was before Jesus. He simply says, look, all I know is this man stepped into my story and said, pick up your mat and walk. He healed me, so I picked up my mat and I'm walking. I'm living my life in response to this moment that my story in so many ways, when I look back, it's like all of that stuff that I was literally stuck in, all the questions that I was stuck in, all of a sudden are now just like backstory, but the most important part, my one sentence story, is that I was helpless, that I was without hope, that I felt utterly alone, and Jesus stepped into my story, that he got me unstuck and put me moving forward. We walk differently. We walk differently when we've picked up our mats and walked. And we all share this story. This is what's so beautiful about this. We may not be laying by a pool waiting for the waters to move and trying to get in the water to be healed, but we all have stuck stories, whether it's that we're in the middle of one right now or we're living in the aftermath, still holding on to some of the pieces of it, trying to make sense of what we've walked through. We all share these moments of hopeless and helpless and alone, and then Jesus. Right? And then Jesus stepped into our stories. Some of us maybe still on our mats saying, I can't. We're living right in the middle of our stuck story, some living in the aftermath of our stuck story, and we're trying to figure out a next step, still holding on to some of the questions. But this story is good news for all of us, because every conversation with Jesus is an invitation, not a negotiation. Right? When we look at our own stuck stories, that we look and just like Jesus 2,000 years ago, talking to the man and having this conversation with him, that he's not expecting us to say, God, I'm going to clean myself up and do all these things to try and get you to do what I hope you'll do. That it's not a negotiation, that it's an invitation from Jesus to step into healing, to step into wholeness, that Jesus simply invites us to respond. That the God who created you as a whole person cares for you as a whole person, mind, body, soul. Right? As precious as our soul is, that's not all God is concerned about. Imagine this God who cares about us as whole people, if we entrusted our whole selves to him, saying, God, what is it that you want for me? And what is it that you want from me? What does life look like lived in you? To even take whatever our stuck question is, and maybe for some of us, we're already thinking exactly what that stuck question is. Maybe we've even written it in the margins of our notes as we were having this conversation this morning. We know what our stuck question is. Can you imagine this God who created us as whole people, seeing us as whole people, caring for us as whole people, interested in even the hard, stuck questions of our lives? What if we would take that and entrust our stuck questions to him? To name it, and then give it over to him. And Jesus can give you a whole new story. And that story starts with 3 simple words: all I know. Right? All I know is how things were. All I know is the mess that I had made. All I know is that I was helpless and I was hopeless and feeling utterly alone. And Jesus stepped into my story. And over time, as God continues to work, as Jesus continues to invite you, to take you through this healing process, over time, your hopeless, helpless, and alone story becomes exhibit A of your Jesus story. Right? All of us have mats that we can point to, say, I was stuck. I was hopeless. There was no way forward from where I was. But Jesus invited me. God stepped into my story, invited me to pick up my mat, tuck it under my arm, and walk. And so what was the setting of utter hopelessness, utter helplessness, utter aloneness, isolation, has now become exhibit A of my Jesus story. It's tucked under my arm, and we walk differently when we've been told to pick up our mats and walk. And so the invitation this morning is very simple, to say, pick up our mats. tuck that mat under our arms, walk with pride because God has stepped into our story and is inviting us into a whole new phase of life. That the mat that you have been laying on, is not who you are. The mat that you've been laying on is not who you were. It's simply where you were when Jesus stepped into your story. Does that make sense? It's not your identity. It's not even who you used to be. It's simply the place you were when Jesus stepped in, when Jesus began to move you forward. And so if we're carrying a mat this morning, let's carry it with pride because that makes it's holy ground. This is the place where God showed up, where he met you. And when someone asks about it, we don't hide from it. We don't even hide our questions. We're not worried about what other people might think of the questions that we have. We say, look, all I know is in the midst of my questions, God showed up. He met me and he gave me deeper and better questions. We walk differently when we've picked up our mats and walked. It's an invitation to get well, to live well, and to tell your story. Let's pray. God, thank you. God, thank you for your son, Jesus Christ, who steps into the hard questions of life. God, the one whose stories and echoes, God, can continue this morning to give us hope. And God, I pray, I know in this room, God, I know in those places where what's happening in this room is being sent, online streaming and all those kinds of things, God, I know that there are people, God, who are living in stuck questions. God, I pray. God, I pray your grace and your peace. God, I pray that you would bring hope. God, that you would step in where there's need for healing, that you would heal. God, where there's need of hope, that you would bring hope. God, where there's fear and isolation, God, that you would step in and you would bring peace and connection. God, that's what you do. God, that's what you've done for me. It's what you've done for so many of us. So God, I pray that we be a people who offered the invitation to a new phase of life in you, God, that we would take you up on it. God, that we would respond, that we would stand up, pick up our mats, and we would start walking, and we'd walk differently because you have encountered us, you have met us, and you have transformed us as whole people. And so we pray this all in the name of your son, Jesus Christ. God, in his name, the name who sets us free. God, the name that brings healing. God, the name that is powerful. God, that gives us freedom. God, it's in the name of Jesus we pray. Amen.